Let's create a mental ray sun and sky through a daylight system. In the Create panel, go over to Systems, the little gears, and we see Sunlight and Daylight. Sunlight is just the sun with no indirect illumination, and it creates a standard directional light. As such, it has no support for the ART renderer. There's no compelling reason to use the sunlight because its functionality is incorporated into the daylight system, which also allows us to create a skylight and an environment. Click on Daylight, and we get a dialog. You're creating a daylight system. We want you to use mental ray photographic exposure control. Well, that's fine. We actually want to use the physical camera exposure control, but for now, we can say yes. We can change up the exposure control module later. Now that's been enabled and we're in creation mode. Let's go over to the top viewport, middle mouse drag around there just to move the view, and then click with the left mouse button and drag out to create a compass rose. Release the mouse and then drag to set the orbital distance or the distance to the sun. This is just for purposes of display in the viewport and it does not affect the lighting. Click and then the object is created. And when you're finished, right-click to exit creation mode. Now we've got a system that has a so-called daylight head. And we can use the selection tool, click on that object at the top there, and that is the daylight head. We've also got that compass rose, and that simply allows us to move the whole system around in the view. And again, that does not affect the lighting, it's just for convenience. All right, so select the daylight head, and then go into the Modify panel. And in the Daylight Assembly Head Daylight Parameters, we can define which module we want to use for the sunlight and the skylight. And it's defaulted to the 3ds Max Scanline renderer options. Let's change the sunlight to MR Sun and the skylight to MR Sky. And we get another dialog saying you're creating a mental ray sky. It's recommended to also add a mental ray physical sky environment map. Do we want to do this? Yes. And now we have all three pieces of the daylighting in place. We have direct light from the sun, indirect light from the sky, and we also have an environment that will show up in reflections. We're now in a good position to do our first rendering. Click in the physical camera viewport to give it focus, and we'll do a render to the rendered frame window. Click on Render Production. First, we see the terrain objects being processed. The planes are being tessellated into very small triangles and displaced. Then we see a mosaic effect. That is the final gathering or global illumination pass. And then finally, we see our draft quality render come in one bucket at a time. That's a pretty good result without even having adjusted any parameters. Let's go back to the daylight assembly head, and we can adjust the sun's position in the sky. That will also affect the background. To do that, we want to go to the motion panel, not the modify panel. And here we can assign a location in the world. I'll do that. I'll go down here to Get Location, and I'm going to choose Salt Lake City, Utah. Click OK. And I'll set up the hour and the date of the year. We'll make the time 1500 hours, or 3 p.m. And I'll set the date to 9 or September 1st, 2016. And I'm putting in these values specifically because later on, when we get to image-based lighting, I've got an environment that was set up with exactly these parameters. With those parameters adjusted, let's now do another rendering. And to make sure that we always render the perspective view, I'm going to go into the render setup and click on the perspective panel so that it says Phys Camera 001 and then lock it. There's another lock switch up here, but I believe this one is more reliable. And we'll go ahead and do another rendering, having changed the date, time, and location. And that's the end result of our first attempt at a daylight system. We haven't adjusted the exposure or done anything to the environment yet, but already it's looking pretty good.